All right, I'd now like to have the pleasure of introducing Professor Michael Lens. He's an associate professor of urban planning and public policy at UCLA and the associate faculty director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. Professor Lens's research and teaching explore the potential of public policy to address housing market inequities that lead to negative outcomes for low-income families and communities of color. This research involves housing interventions such as subsidies, tenant protections, and production. Ongoing research projects focus on the neighborhood context of eviction, housing supply in California, and a book project that examines 50 years of neighborhood change in Black neighborhoods following the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And with that, I'll hand the microphone virtually off to Professor Lens.
Thank you, Yolanda and Kate, for starting us off, and Kate in particular for introducing me. And welcome to everybody out there in various locations, and thank you to Dartmouth and the wonderful group of people and centers that have made this possible. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen and take it away with my talk here. There we go. Can everybody, or Kate, is this what you see? Okay. So I want to talk a bit about the legacy of redlining in Los Angeles and some of the policy mechanisms at play that can help alleviate some of the segregation that we see in Los Angeles and other places, as well as address housing affordability. So a little bit about me and my work to situate it in this context. So I'm motivated, as Kate introduced, I'm motivated by inequalities in housing markets, and much of that motivation comes from what public policy can do to alleviate poverty. And a huge aspect of living in poverty in this country and elsewhere is an inability to afford safe, secure, and decent housing. And so much of my past work has focused on housing subsidies with attention to neighborhood opportunities and segregation by race and income. Done some work on eviction, particularly in Southern California. And some of my current work, Kate alluded to my a book project on Black neighborhoods over the last 50 years. Some fair housing work, which is very exciting in California, is a policy area in which fair housing is pretty robust, and there's a few projects where we're evaluating that. Still doing some work in the voucher, in evaluating housing voucher outcomes, particularly in Northern California. And then recently with some colleagues at UCLA, we've been engaged in evaluating the extent to which people are able to pay the rent through COVID and the consequences when they're not able to do so. So, one thing you may notice, from much of my work is that it's mostly contemporary, and I'm taking, I'm doing quite a bit of, I'll be talking about quite a bit of history here, particularly pertaining to Los Angeles. And so in this talk, I want to make sure that I emphasize that I'm not drawing on only my own work, but that of many others. And particularly if you're interested in learning more about some of the historical topics that I'm covering here today, I can recommend probably several things, but certainly 3 pieces that are pretty central to what I'm talking about. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson on the Great Migration, that covers lots, really Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, chiefly. City of Segregation by Andrea Gibbons, which is really focused on the history of segregation and the history of housing struggles against segregation in Los Angeles. And then Black Los Angeles, which is edited by Darnell Hunt and Ana Cristina Ramon, that has several really interesting chapters about the evolution of Black Los Angeles. So I don't want to start, all the way at the beginning, but somewhere early in the process of how Black Los Angeles came to be, and it's impossible to tell that story without at least introducing the Great Migration, in which that was the movement of around 6 million Black Americans from the largely rural South to cities in the North. And I think most of us are familiar with the legacy of slavery and sharecropping in the South, and the incredible economic constraints as well as threats of violence that inspired Black Americans to flee the South in large numbers and seek, what was, often thought of as a promised land in the North. I think many of us are familiar with the idea that, or the reality that, northern cities and western cities later in the process, such as Los Angeles, did not exactly provide this promised land. And I'll talk about, of course, some of the that context in housing discrimination in particular. But that was a process that brought Black Los Angeles to the place that it came to be by the middle of the 21st century in post-war Los Angeles in particular. So Los Angeles comes later in the Great Migration story, and like other destinations on the Great Migration path, was a destination that was the result of particular geographic pathways. So on the eastern part of the country, well, everywhere throughout the Great Migration, people tended to follow rail lines, and that led people from Georgia and the Carolinas to go up to New York. It led people from Alabama and Mississippi, such as my grandparents, to move up to Chicago. And then most Black Los Angeles people came from Texas and Louisiana, and so that was the population that ended up in Los Angeles. And this is what this kind of looks like, visually, where I just summarized kind of these general pathways. So to the extent I think that people spend much time talking about housing discrimination in the mid 20th century, not always a party topic back when we had parties, but to the extent to which we talk about this, redlining, especially recently, I think, tends to draw the attention. But redlining was both short-lived as kind of a formal practice, and also one of many discriminatory practices that held sway in Los Angeles and other places. But as Andrea Gibbons and many others argue and document, redlining really enshrined race as arguably the primary factor in land and property valuation. And so that, so that is to say, like, our focus on redlining is not necessarily like the wrong kind of focus to have, because its history and its legacy is actually really quite important, I would say. And also, redlining maps are very vivid and great, so it's a great place to begin. So here is at this juncture rather well circulated redlining map of Los Angeles. And so I can't take you probably through all these neighborhoods here in this particular map, and it's a beautiful map. But what does this mean? According to documents from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was charged with purchasing foreclosed and delinquent properties in the 1930s, as a result of the Great Recession, we had quite a lot of those, of course. And also inspiring the Federal Housing Administration's decisions in terms of which loans it was going to back and therefore make more possible and plentiful and affordable. They carved up different metropolitan areas and cities into green at the top, then blue, then yellow, then red in terms of their color classification scheme based on the level of risk that was perceived at that time. What was that level of risk largely dependent upon or based on? It's largely based on the newness of an area and the newness of the housing stock, and also, of course, the racial composition of those neighborhoods. And so your green neighborhoods are your white and almost entirely in white neighborhoods. Your blue neighborhoods are considerably homogeneous as well and largely white. Yellow is, to use the language of the homeowners loan corporation, beginning to see an infiltration of less desirable populations. And your red neighborhoods are, at this point, largely African American, if not entirely, and seen as the riskiest place to make these investments in loans or to back the loans at all. So, it's important to emphasize, of course, that the modern mortgage financing system was non-existent before the United States government created it, largely as a response to the Great Depression by backstopping these loans to the Federal Housing Administration and ensuring these private mortgages. But of course, labeling these black or mixed neighborhoods much more risky, and also outlawing in most circumstances the ability of Black people to get loans in homogeneous white neighborhoods, because that itself would make those white spaces less valued. And so this system created was explicitly racist, right? Mortgages in white neighborhoods were backed by the federal government and other neighborhoods were not. And race mixing in neighborhoods was explicitly prevented. And again, I want to circle back. Although this was a process that was not, that did not, dominate all mortgage lending for decades, it formalized the devaluation of Black space and legitimized the exclusion of Black home seekers in white spaces, or delegitimized. So redlining legitimizes further, I would argue, other forms of racial discrimination in these markets, right? Violence against Blacks attempting to move into white areas is well documented and goes on throughout the country. And one reason that this is legitimized is because white homeowners had reason to believe that their property values would decline if Black people moved into those neighborhoods, right? And this isn't just a mortgage story, right? This is real estate agents that steered people of particular racial backgrounds to particular neighborhoods, and then later on found profit motive through something called blockbusting, where you could introduce Black home seekers into white neighborhoods and get a lot of turnover from white neighbors that were motivated to sell. That's, of course, it's not all about private actions. Of course, it's also the GI Bill, which was disproportionately bestowed upon white veterans returning from World War II, and then we had racial segregation in public housing as well. But it's important to, I think, uplift the rich history of housing struggle in Los Angeles. This is a picture of Charlotta Bass, who's likely to be the first Black woman to own a newspaper in this country. She took over the California Eagle, this is a photo of the California Eagle. She took this over in 1912 and used it as a platform for Black uplift in Los Angeles, and housing discrimination was a central cause for her and the paper and her organizations to fight against. Much of this work included pushing back against racial covenants, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, really neighborhood by neighborhood, house by house, until eventually racial covenants were struck down by the US Supreme Court in 1948, although that did not end the practice of racial covenants or restrictions on the sale to African Americans outside of white districts. So this is a picture of I guess, evidence or advertising for racial covenants. And what a racial covenant was a widespread practice of placing a restriction on a deed of sale for a home, where you were mandated not to sell your home to somebody that was not of the white race, would be one variation of that, or somebody that was Black, right? And so again, these racial covenants were widespread around the country, and really came into force in the 1920s and 30s in large practice after the Supreme Court struck down racial zoning, where there was a point at which, cities could say, like, this is a Black neighborhood and this is a white neighborhood. The Supreme Court strikes that down, and then you have to go, house by house, deed by deed, property by property, and place those covenants on homes at that level. You could argue that on the one hand, Los Angeles was a more hospitable destination for many Blacks than places like Detroit and Chicago and New York at the time. But California was still, of course, a very discriminatory place, and you have evidence of this from a much different newspaper than the California Eagle, with the Los Angeles Mirror News, and which they had a counter of how many Black people, or Negroes in the parlance of the time, was moving to Los Angeles. And I don't think this was a celebratory cartoon. Again, Black Los Angeles persisted. Fair housing and civil rights activists were successful in passing California's Rumford Act in 1963, which was the precursor to the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act, and outlawed discrimination by race in the sale or rental of housing in California. This was an enormous victory, but was overturned in the subsequent year by California's often dreaded direct democracy in the form of Proposition 14. California Supreme Court overturns Proposition 14 the next year, but then the year after that, the Federal Fair Housing Act comes into being in 1968. That kind of renders all this moot. But it's important to emphasize the incredible gains made by California's fair housing activists over the years. Okay. Let's speed ahead a bit to the present. So again, returning to this redlining map as a bit of a pivot to where we are today. I want to kind of highlight the red sections to, I guess, would be on your right, because it's on my right. Downtown Los Angeles is largely that white area where there's not so much residential space. And then as you head south or down, it's what I would call right now the 110 corridor, although I think at the time of this map, there was no 110 freeway. So that red line that goes south on your screen is what we would call years ago, prior to the 1992 LA uprising, the South Central Los Angeles, kind of core Black Los Angeles for many, many years. And we now refer to that as South LA, and as that is more fashionable post riots. But that area has stretched and morphed into something that is certainly more complicated than just Black Los Angeles. And here's another set of maps looking at 1960 on the left, 1990 in the middle, and 2017 on the right. And this map shows this kind of evolution and really what I would argue an exodus of Black Los Angeles. In 1960, the Black population was heavily concentrated along that 110 corridor. Again, South Central or South Los Angeles, and lines up pretty clearly with our redlining map. By 1990, Black Los Angeles had migrated to the west and to the north quite a bit, which that was a result of really important gains in the ability for people to move out of a very constrained geographic space prior to the Fair Housing Act and prior to fights against racial covenants. By 2017, you'll see that there's only a handful of census tracts that are overwhelmingly Black, and not that many that are even a majority. In some other analyses, South Los Angeles, kind of depending on how you define it geographically, has gone from about 37% Black and 53% Hispanic in 1990 to about 21% Black and 65% Hispanic in 2015. And of course, this has a lot to do with immigration to the Los Angeles area from Mexico and Central American countries over the years, and also has a lot to do with just general trends in the suburbanization of Black Americans that you see in cities in Los Angeles and elsewhere. Here's another look at this, and I can promise I'm not pandering to Dartmouth's Department of Geography. This is something that is very frequent. This is a slide or a variation of a slide that I use all the time, because mixedmetro.com is something that some of you may be familiar with, and is a collaboration of Dartmouth Professor Richard Wright and some other colleagues around the country. So shout out to Professor Wright, and a shout out to the Dartmouth Department of Geography, which produces really my favorite segregation website, and I have a few. So the point here of this slide, other than again pandering to Dartmouth, although I'm not really, is that the overwhelming the overwhelming sites of racial concentration in Southern California more broadly is not a concentration of African Americans, which you see in green. There's still a disproportionate concentration of African Americans in South Los Angeles and some of the more suburban areas to the south and east. But largely what we have in Southern California, in the Los Angeles metro more specifically, is a concentration of Latino neighborhoods and Latino dominant neighborhoods, which greatly complicates the racial picture of South Los Angeles more broadly. So why did we have this Black exodus from South LA? There are a lot of reasons why Blacks have left South Los Angeles. Again, some of this has to do with immigration to the region. Some of this is, again, Black suburbanization. But undoubtedly, I think two things that I'll emphasize. One real quickly, and then I'll talk more about the other going forward. The first is the 1992 uprising, and this is a picture of U.S. Army personnel occupying South Los Angeles after the 1992 riots or uprising. And this was an incredible moment in the racial landscape of 1990s America. It's an incredible upheaval in South Los Angeles specifically, but Los Angeles more broadly, both racially and in terms of the highlight that it placed on the incredibly broken relationships between the police and Black Angelenos specifically. And of course, we still are grappling with that to this day in Los Angeles and other American cities. But that really reached a fever pitch, of course, with the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of the 4 police officers that executed that beating. And so undoubtedly, this 1992 uprising plays a big role in the exodus, and not just the uprising, but the conditions of violence and police oppression in South Los Angeles plays a big role in the exodus of Black Los Angeles. But another thing that I would argue that plays a huge role in creating some of these statistics that I'll run through quick is the housing affordability crisis in Los Angeles that disproportionately affects Black Los Angeles. And so that's where I'll run through the rest of my talk. So in 1960, LA County contains 93% of the metropolitan area's Black population. The vast majority of that is in what is known at that time as South Central Los Angeles. By 1990, that goes 81%. By 2019, that's 64%. LA County, in a 25-year period or 35-year period from 1980 onwards, loses over 120,000 Black residents. And many of those residents are not leaving California altogether, not leaving Southern California altogether. They're going to neighboring counties such as San Bernardino County and Riverside County, where housing is much cheaper. And by some measures, we talk about gentrification and displacement a lot in urban conversations these days. LA has arguably the nation's worst displacement right now. It is the only region where more residents live in areas that have experienced low income displacement than have experienced low income concentration. In other words, most places, if you live in a neighborhood that is not very well off, or there's lots of people living in poverty, the main problem there is that you are experiencing increasing concentration of people living in poverty. That's not the typical experience in low-income neighborhoods in the Los Angeles area, where people are more likely to be leaving and being displaced from those neighborhoods, often being replaced by people of higher incomes because the housing is scarce and unaffordable. So what does housing unaffordability look like somewhere like South Los Angeles? So this is the share of residents spending more than 50% of their income on rent in 3 different spaces. West Los Angeles in the blue, South Los Angeles in the red, and East Central Los Angeles in the orange. Kind of these are kind of large geographic areas, but the takeaway here is how much worse the affordability problem is in South Central or South Los Angeles in the Watts region than other areas in Los Angeles. It is incredibly typical for people to spend upwards of 50% of their income on rent in those places. So I argue that this is all part of a legacy of redlining, and that legacy is not just something that happened back a long time ago, but it is something that we continue to practice in a way that has kind of evolved over time. And I would say that our practices have to do with something that many people call exclusionary zoning, which is really the exclusion of various forms of housing that are often more affordable for people of color. So Los Angeles has a huge affordability problem. It's always been an unaffordable place, but is much more unaffordable than it used to be. And these affordability problems cause and interact with at least 3 issues, 2 of which I've already talked about a fair amount: segregation and gentrification and displacement, one of which I'm just introducing right now, which is homelessness. The homelessness crisis is much worse in California than in other places. Nearly, by some counts, 1 in 4 people experiencing homelessness live in California. Black people are in Los Angeles are radically disproportionately affected by homelessness or experience homelessness, where they make up 9%, or we make up 9% of the LA County population, but a staggering 40% of its homeless population. So hugely, all 3 of these issues and housing affordability more broadly affects Black Los Angeles more than other Angelenos. So specifically with regard to the legacy of redlining, like, why do these patterns of segregation persist? Some of the overt discrimination that I talked about, whether it's racial covenants or violence against Black home seekers, is far less common or relatively non-existent. Some of the mortgage discrimination exists, but it's not like it used to be. But we still have this legacy of redlining in which home seekers of various races and ethnicities have pejorative perceptions of African Americans and those spaces, and they avoid them and they devalue them. So we still are holding on to the formal devaluation of Blackness, of Black space that redlining so clearly codified. And then, an important thing to these last 2 bullets, important things to think about in terms of exclusionary zoning is, 1, we make it very easy for neighborhoods and cities to exclude particular housing types, multifamily housing in the specific. And because we have such wide gaps in income and wealth between African Americans and most other groups, particularly white Americans, it is it's very difficult for Black people to afford single family homes, in particular in places that are majority white and of high value. So exclusionary zoning as a specific definition, we have land use regulations that come in many forms for, that determine how land can be used for residential space, commercial space, industrial, and what types of residential space. Many land use regulations have an exclusionary intent and are kind of one of the ways that racial covenants and redlining have evolved into other forms of exclusion or other mechanisms of exclusion. The simplest versions of these are things like minimum lot sizes that force you to buy kind of a large space, parking requirements, floor to area ratios that kind of govern how large your structure can be in relation to the lot that it's on, and very importantly, single family zoning, which mandates that large spaces in metropolitan areas can only have a single family home built on them. So what does Los Angeles look like in terms of this? You will see that there's a lot of yellow on this map in terms of the residential space, in terms of how residential space is zoned. There's a bunch of mountain and forest land that is in the green. But if you compare the amount of land that is dedicated for single family zoning and where multifamily zoning or multifamily homes are allowed, you'll see that, of course, the yellow dwarfs the blue. And so the point here is that huge portions of Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City in particular are places where you cannot build anything other than a single family home for somebody to live in. And if you think about this spatially, where are the places where you're more likely to be able to build multifamily housing? It's in the areas near downtown, heading down to the 110 corridor again, really echoing some of our redlining maps. Banning multifamily housing often bans people of color. It doesn't mean that all Black people live in apartments or can only afford apartments. I'm a Black person living in a single family home. I bought it, with my own money and my wife's money, and it's doable for a lot of people. But disproportionately, Black Americans and Black Angelenos in particular are less likely to be able to afford a single family home than others. So multifamily home bans tend to exacerbate segregation. And here are some sites, including some work of my own, that finds that single family zoning and other land use regulations of this type relate very strongly to segregation by race and segregation by income. This is just a little bit more evidence. If you don't believe the fact that that Black home ownership and Black single family home residence is a little bit more difficult than such home ownership and residence for other racial groups. The home ownership rate in Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles for Blacks is only 26.7% compared to 47% for non-Hispanic whites. And obviously, those are both way lower than the US average, where Black home ownership is far less likely to be, is below 50% nationwide. And then this is kind of circling back to this question of rent burden, where our failure to build homes also produces higher rents for Black households. It not only kind of, I think, gives us more segregation, it gives us fewer home ownership opportunities, but it also, when you're renting, you have higher rent burdens, where the percent of paying that are paying 50% or more of their income on rent in the city of Los Angeles for Black renters is over 40% compared to 31% for whites. So there's roughly three things we can do about this. We can do about housing affordability more broadly. There's not a ton of tools to make housing less expensive. One is that we can build more, and that's much of what I've talked about so far is the fact that we really constrain the extent to which we build housing, and we really wall off multifamily housing in very specific places, making segregation worse as well, and making it difficult for people to afford housing in places with higher opportunities and better schools and lower crime and that sort of stuff. So we can build more that has kind of the best long run effects on housing affordability. And this is a very local decision-making process, right? Where the city of Los Angeles has a planning department and a set of city council persons that have large influence on land use, but also neighborhood associations and very small, unelected, loud neighbors really affect the extent to which you can get anything built in places. And then the other two things we can do is we can give people money through subsidies, and we can, initiate price controls such as rent control, right? I'm not saying that like building more housing is the only thing we should do by any stretch. These are all complementary policies, and it's very much a kind of yes and approach. I think that is the most likely to be the most effective to both combat segregation and make housing more affordable, particularly for people in communities of color. So, kind of my policy pitch in these conversations is often to legalize multifamily housing. You can legalize multifamily housing that's not particularly large, so that's more like mid-sized multifamily housing, duplexes, triplexes, quads, small apartment buildings, to not like radically change single-family neighborhoods very quickly. And we need to emphasize doing this in higher opportunity neighborhoods, which are traditionally and disproportionately homogenous kind of white spaces. And all of this is, I think, part and parcel of what I would call a real fair housing strategy. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and that gets rid of discrimination on paper, but it hasn't produced integrated outcomes and spaces in most of metropolitan America. And so, one piece that I've recently published with some colleagues is an argument for ending single-family zoning altogether. There are some places that have done this. Minneapolis, Oregon, and California has kind of whittled around the edges on single-family zoning through the ability to build kind of second units on your property in single-family neighborhoods. Again, building more housing is a necessary but very much insufficient solution. And so zoning reform is necessary, but other things that we do in terms of giving people more money to afford housing through subsidies, by engaging in aggressive tenant protections and funding those tenant protections, is very important. So I'm going to stop there. I hope we can have a good Q&A and robust discussion with the time that we have left. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that talk. I think that there's a lot to discuss now. And I think that for those of you who are planning to join future events in our series, hopefully this really gave you the background that will be sort of necessary to understand how patterns of energy, environmental, and racism, police brutality, and ongoing impacts of this housing crisis that Professor Lens just described are manifesting in LA today. So we really see this as a foundational event of this series, in that it will inform how we see all these other landscapes that we're going to investigate later. Yeah, so I guess now it's time for Q&A. Yolanda and I will take any questions you have in the chat, and we will pass them along, or we'll ask you to unmute yourself if you use the raise hand feature. And if you don't know how to use that, just you can ask a question in the chat, ask how to use that feature, and someone will help you with that.
We've got our first question here in the chat, actually. So let's see. It says, after hearing all, and this is from John Kindred, after hearing all the past and today's problems we have and still face, what are we going to do now that climate change and sea level rise will make things worse with the problems they bring, like climate gentrification, climate migration, climate refugees, environmental racism, and natural disaster that will make things much worse all over the world? That's a big question.
Yeah, John, are you asking like how those problems are going to impact the issues that Professor Lens just discussed, or is that like a general question about policy in LA?
It's LA and all over. Already, these problems have been happening for the last 5 or 10 years. especially in Florida, where a lot of people are moving to, and eventually they're going to have to leave Florida because Florida is mostly lowland. And if you look at most of the people in the United States live along our coastline, and that's in the highest prime real estate. And those areas are already looking at buying up property in areas of mostly of color, and those people are getting pushed out. There's been documentaries on PBS called Shrinking Cities, and we see what's happening at our border in California and other states. And a lot of these people are not just from South America, Mexico, or Central America. They're coming from other countries, coming through that way. We see what's been going on for years over in Europe, people coming from Africa and the Middle East and other countries. And we have not addressed this. And you figure, if you look at the history of the problems that were just talked about, and things have only gotten worse, we're spending more money, what's going to happen when these other problems will increase? And you look at our natural disasters, the West Coast, we got more fires, people are leaving. Texas, that will happen again in the years to come. We have not replaced homes far as back as Katrina and Hurricane Sandy. And so if we're not replacing the homes that we lost and we have a shortage, what does that say for us? And also too, a lot of areas that we won't be able to build homes or anything anymore because of the problem that it would cost us. Insurance companies are now making it hard for people to get insurance. FEMA has to step in sometimes. The East Coast is going to really be hit. New York, Boston, and other areas, which is prime real estate. And people of color, if they're hurting now, what is it going to be like? And we're not addressing this. Housing, homeless organizations, environmental organizations are not working together to address these problems. We are not changing the way we do business. We're still doing things we've been doing in the past. And even our young people that's in college to be our next leaders, a lot of this stuff, they don't know what's going on in their own backyards. So how are we going to deal with this? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to stay in my lane here because I don't, my expertise has very little to do with climate change and the environment. But, I unfortunately agree with virtually everything you just said. And I say unfortunately because it's a very somber future, I think, that you point out there. And but what I would add to that is the discussion on housing production that I ended with is really focused on what we call infill housing, right? Housing that housing that is in an existing city on parcels that are already developed in some way, and finding ways to make a higher and better use of those areas. So, what you think about much of Los Angeles and its investments in transit infrastructure that are hopefully supposed to get people out of their cars and driving less and contributing less to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. And yet we have, and not very far from where I'm standing right now, we have single family neighborhoods that really kind of take the mass out of mass transit, right? You've got these rail stations surrounded by really a handful of homes on the grand scheme of things. And so we have to find ways to build more in our existing cities and add to the density where it already exists, rather than hoping that we can build out in these now extremely fire-prone areas that you alluded to, John, and thinking that we're going to solve our housing affordability problem through sprawl. If we solve our housing affordability problem through sprawl, then we're going to have people in their cars for longer distances, spewing more greenhouse gas emissions and burning our forests and, you know, getting our coastlines completely wiped out. So, you know, that's, I think, you know, where, to me, like, the urgency of housing affordability and climate change intersect most obviously.
Thank you. Are there other questions that people would like to ask, either by raising hands or throwing them in the chat? It looks like Damien has a question. Damien, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Hi, so I'm a geography major at Dartmouth, and I've taken some courses that touched on similar topics, although not in depth. And I was wondering, on your research, if you found that maybe the the dispersion of Black populations in LA was maybe affected by kind of like an engineering from organizations in power, like you said, I don't know LA very well, so I don't really travel a lot, but the construction of a corridor in what was once a was more prominent Black neighborhood. Do you think like that was specifically done on purpose? Have you done any research connected to that?
Well, I mean, you know, I think, you know, I think Los Angeles is like many U.S. cities in terms of the history of containment of the Black population in specific locations, right? And the heavy resistance to allowing people to move out of those contained neighborhoods. And then, you know, one thing that your question reminds me of, you know, as kind of one source of a cause of a Black exodus to other spaces is also, you know, the construction of freeways, right? And so like the construction of the 110 freeway, the construction of the 10 freeway, like other metropolitan areas was disproportionately done in places where people of color already lived, and not just Black communities, you know, more traditionally Hispanic and Latino communities on the east side of Los Angeles have like some of the most horrific concentrations of freeways, you know, slamming through those neighborhoods than you will see anywhere in the country. If you look at Boyle Heights and East LA. But, you know, the 110 and the 10 undoubtedly broke up existing Black neighborhoods. And then, so like, who are the kind of masterminds behind that? You know, those are, you know, white transportation engineers and elected officials that had priorities that had very little to do with the preservation of these important Black spaces. And, you know, so, you know, I think that's one way to think about like how these were intentional decisions sometimes. I mean, you know, there's various forces that lead to this discriminatory and segregating behavior, but then like something like highways or the location of public housing and things like that, like those are public decisions made in those times by people that were not, you know, did not feel accountable to Black Los Angeles.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question. There's a question from Amelia in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, yes. I was just really curious, just as like someone who lives on the East Coast and uses, you know, the subway system all the time. And you spoke to this briefly, but I'm curious about how improving or supplementing the LA transit system could have a causal benefit to inhabitants. Just because I wonder if displacement is also a product of just, you know, needing to travel so far outside LA County. And I was wondering if you had studied any of that at all.
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of my colleagues do study this stuff. You know, I'm not a transportation expert, but you know, Los Angeles is in the midst of a very complicated attempt to rejigger its transit system. And you know, this starts with the passage of Measure M in the mid 2010s that really accelerates the expansion and construction of our rail system. And we've got, new lines going through South Los Angeles along the Crenshaw corridor. That are set to open in the next couple of years, or a new line and new stations. We have already 7 or 8 years ago the opening of the Expo line that goes through the west side and out to the beach. So we have invested heavily in our transit infrastructure, at least on the rail side. A lot of people would say that we're taking some resources and investment away from bus, which is traditionally the most disproportionately used by people of color and low-income households, and what we call transit-dependent riders, right? And during this time, we've seen a reduction in the share of people using transit to commute around Los Angeles. And like, all of this is pre-COVID stuff, right? Like we were throwing a bunch of money in our rail transit and seeing some pretty bad results in terms of ridership. So that's really concerning stuff. And I think it speaks to how hard it is to take a behemoth like this and like the LA metro area and steer this ship. Maybe I've got the Suez Canal in my mind. Steer this ship from this very very car dependent place into one where people are increasingly getting around outside of their cars. So I think I'm hopeful that like we're in the growing pains stage of that, and we'll come, in 10 to 15 years, like it'll be better off. To the extent to which, this has to, I don't know the kind of the answer to your second question about how much this failure to give people ridership options relates to unemployment. It certainly does. I just don't know how much that's kind of a factor in some of the stuff I've been talking about.
Thank you so much. I think we have one last question, if that's all right with you, Michael.
Sure.
Yes. Okay. So from Vicky Vertiz, wondering if you've read about any arts development projects that have helped reduce or improve the impacts of environmental racism, or that have had positive effects on BIPOC communities.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. This question came from Vicky. Wondering if you've read about any arts development projects that have helped reduce or improve the impacts of environmental racism, or that have had positive effects on BIPOC communities.
I don't know. That's kind of outside of my knowledge space, to be honest.
Okay, I think that was our last question. And also a thank you for John for putting in so much knowledge into the chat here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also want to shout out Kathleen. Cities have too many rules. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I like that. That's just like, this professor just gets to talking so much. Just cities have too many rules. You put it beautifully.
Yeah, and so for everyone who is interested in learning more about what kind of action you can take, both in LA and in the Upper Valley, I know we have some folks here tuning in from local to us. So we will be sending out some action items via email, so watch out for those. We will be talking a little bit more about Measure J, which just passed in November, I think November 3rd, I think it was, just on kind of funding, providing 10% of LA's budget to transformative justice initiatives, things like housing development and housing resources, as well as another Prop 17 that passed with Measure J, that will allow formerly incarcerated folks to the right to vote, which is around the block great and should always be a thing. So yeah, we will be talking a little bit more via email about what actions to take both in LA and in the Upper Valley. But with that, thank you so much, Michael Lens, for joining us today, and for everyone who took the time out of their day to come to this event. Be sure to check out our next event, April 8th, which Kate is projecting here, with East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. They will be giving a lecture and workshop talking about the toxic impact of exide plants situated near communities of color. It's not our event, but there will also be a police violence virtual symposium showcasing global and local perspectives, running from April 5th to 11th. And the opening events will be open access to everyone. So that's going to be accessible to the Hopkins Center's YouTube channel. So I think that is open to just about everyone. But yeah, if we can maybe say thank yous, that's all we have for today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
for being here.